Opera, also known as Terror at the Opera, is another fine example of an Italian giallo film. We'll get more into that later. An opera company is staging a production of Macbeth by Verdi, originally composed in 1847. The star of the show is injured in a car accident on opening night, and so her young understudy Betty has to take on the role of Lady Macbeth. It is purported to be a cursed opera with many mishaps and tragedies plaguing its history on the stage.
It's the opera. Macbeth brings bad luck.
What are you talking about?
Everyone says it. Macbeth brings bad luck.
The show must go on, and that evening Betty makes her stage debut. During the performance, there is an unseen spectator lurking through the halls of the opera house, avoiding all the stagehands and house staff until they finally find an empty box to view the show.
What are you doing here? You're not allowed in here. This box is for stage personnel only. Come on, let's go. What the hell do you...
The audience, musicians, and stage company are completely oblivious to the poor fool being murdered up in the spectator box, and so once they deal with the busted light, the show continues, receiving thunderous applause. After the performance, Betty gets all the kudos from her agent, her seamstress, her director, and this random opera enthusiast.
Ah, you're a fan of mine.
Yes.
The first.
Betty goes off to celebrate privately with Stefano, her stage manager boyfriend, but someone else is in there with them. When Stefano leaves the room, she is bound and gagged by a masked, black-gloved assailant who also tapes a row of needles to her eyes, forcing her to watch whatever transpires.
Take a good look. If you try to close your eyes, you'll tear them apart. So you'll just have to watch everything.
When Stefano returns, he is quite brutally murdered in front of Betty. So the needles are supposed to prevent her from closing her eyes, but it's kind of funny because when you look closely, the needles are about a mile away from her eyes, but details. And then the killer just lets her go. Once outside, she reports the murder to the police and then just happens to run into Marco, her director. He takes her home and she tells him what happened. The next day, an inspector named Santini arrives at the opera house to question the staff, and hey, that's that random dude from earlier. On top of Stefano's murder, a piece of Betty's wardrobe was found slashed the night before, as well as a few of the trained ravens that they use in the show. Julia, the seamstress, sets to work repairing the shredded garment and needs Betty around for a fitting once it's all mended. But our black-gloved mystery killer reappears, and it's the same song and dance as before. Bound, gagged, needles under the eyes, and Betty is forced to watch as Julia is finished off. And then the killer just lets her go. Back at her apartment building, Betty runs into Santini, the inspector. Santini tells Betty to go upstairs, lock herself in, and wait for another detective that he's going to send right over to keep guard. The detective does come right over, and she's also joined by Mira, her agent. But then another man comes to the door claiming to also be the detective sent by Santini. He's got the identification and the gun and everything, and this leads to one of the coolest shots in the film. A shot so cool that Quentin Tarantino paid homage to it in Kill Bill. So in true giallo fashion, the plot continues getting more and more ridiculous, particularly how the killer is revealed and who he is. You see, it's explained earlier that ravens have incredibly good memories and can recall people and events for years, and so they were witness to who attacked them and destroyed the costume after opening night. Marco devises a scheme where halfway through a performance, they'll let the ravens loose in the theater, and if the killer is in the audience, they'll find him. Oh boy. But you know, that kind of silliness is really what's fun about the genre. Getting back to Quentin Tarantino, on a recent episode of his Video Archives podcast he does with Roger Avery, they discuss what makes a giallo a giallo. He lists all the big tropes of the genre, and I just have to share it with you.
Let's go through the templates. Yeah. Okay, so basically they all start as big murder mysteries. You don't know who the killer is. Mm-hmm. They don't all have to have black gloves, but most of them have black gloves. Mm-hmm. You're introduced to a whole cast of characters, most of them which will turn out to be victims, but definitely suspicious characters that one will turn out to be the killer. How suspicious they are is almost comical. Everybody could literally be the killer, and everybody has reason to be the killer. The murder sequences, like we were saying, are all like Omen-like set pieces. Finally, there comes a resolution of why the killer is doing what the killer is doing, usually told by the killer as he's facing the last final girl or final guy. And it usually has something to do with their past, and it is so fucking preposterous. You cannot believe that this is the reason that the whole movie is going on. And the crazier and the more preposterous, the better.
Opera was directed by Dario Argento, who is at the forefront of Italian giallo filmmakers. He had an incredible run in the 70s and 80s with films like Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Four Flies on Grey Velvet, Deep Red, Suspiria, Inferno, Tenebrae, and Phenomena. Opera was made in 1987, and I think around that time is when we start to see a big decline in the quality of his work. I guess you can't stay sharp forever. But I'd still place Opera among his most enjoyable and viciously gory outings. Sure, it ventures into the preposterous, but hey, welcome to the world of giallo films. Come on out and have a night at the opera.